and welcome to another video presentation about our topic, select statement. Today, I'm going to discuss how are you going to execute your select statement or query into our SqlYog application. In today's objective, we are going to use SqlYog to run MySQL queries, identify select statement syntax, define select statement to retrieve required information from the database, and use condition to filter query result. To get started, you need to open the necessary software in order to run our query in our database. Our first requirement is to use the XAMPP. Make sure the application is opened and the MySQL database is running in your background, or make sure this button is clicked and the status of the button is like this one. So notice that this particular database is now running because it displays status stop and the MySQL is green. At the same time, after that, you need to open the SqlYog. So I will be using the SqlYog Community Edition. You can download this for free. So some users are having problems with their portable version, so that's why you need to download this version, so manually install this in your computer. Okay, to get started, make sure you successfully open your SqlYog Community Edition. And in this video, I'll be using a database called Inmate database. As you can see, I already have the database imported. So in your activity attached to your LMS material, you will be using the SqlYog database for your activity. So for now, let me use this database as part of my presentation to execute our query. Before executing your query, let us first identify the SqlYog window. So this part here is what we call object window. So you are going to browse your installed databases or developed databases in your MySQL database, and this part here is your query window. This is where you type your select statement or select query. And this one here is our result window. So when you type your query here, the result record will be displayed here, and in case that the query is not successfully executed, some errors will be displayed here. So later we will try our example. So before you start writing query, make sure you're already familiar with the select statement syntax. So let's start by writing a select statement. So before you write your query here, make sure you select properly the database. So when you click the database, it must be something like this. It is bold and it must be displayed here. Now, to start with your select statement, all you have to do is to write a select keyword, and you need to type the column of your table. So in my example, I will be using the employees table. So let us expand this table and see the columns in this particular table. So let's say, for example, I want to examine the contents of this table. So I want to display all the columns and the records. So I will be using asterisk. Okay, let me resize this one. So in order to display the records of this table, all you have to do is to type select. Asterisk means all columns, followed by from, meaning where the records will be extracted. So the name of the table will be employee. So you need to type the employee, the table name from after you type the from keyword. And you need to type semicolon to terminate the statement. So each query should be terminated by semicolon. So in this case, we are now using the select statement syntax. So again, in order to write a select query statement, you need to type the select keyword followed by the column name or asterisk to select all columns, followed by from, and employee, or the table name rather. So as you can see, I am writing my query in a format that is multi-line, or you can write your query in a single line, but for uh, readability purposes, I'm going to write my queries in a multi-line format. Okay, so how do we execute this query? So to execute this query, all you have to do is to click the query itself, or highlight it, or just point your cursor in our statement and click execute query, or just press F9 in your keyboard. So let's try. So after successfully executing the query, you are now seeing the result of your query. So this is now the result window. Okay, so you try to display all the records coming from employees table, including all the columns. Now, if you want to specify specific records or columns that you want to display, instead of using asterisk, you can specify column names. So to examine our column, all you have to do is to look for your table name and expand the columns. As you can see, I have several columns here. So for example, I'm going to display the employee ID. Make sure you follow the same name of the columns. Okay, or as a shortcut, you can just click the table name and go to info, and you are now examining the name of the column. So you can just copy paste. So if you want to specify the column, write the column name followed by comma to specify another column. So I'm going to write the paste or display the employee last name, first name, and of course address, for example. So to ensure that you're writing the correct column name, I suggest to just copy paste, or just ensure that the correct column is being written. So as you can see, I have now specified 4 columns: the employee ID, the last name, first name, and address. So I am expecting that when I run this query, I will be seeing 4 columns. So let's try. So again, all you have to do is to move your cursor inside the statement itself, like this one, and click execute query. So now, as you can see, by executing the query, so let me zoom it first. Okay, so as you can see, I am now seeing the column that I specified in my select keyword, and it came from the employees table. Okay, so let's try another example. So for example, we have this query. So retrieve the product ID, product name, and item price from all rows of the products table. So before you write your query, examine first the query question. So we need to retrieve the column. So as you can see, in this query example, the needed columns are the following: the product ID, the product name, and the item price. And also, it also mentions that it requires all rows, which means all the records coming from the table. And it also mentioned that where may the record came from. So it will be retrieved from the products table. So as we examine our database from our SqlYog, let us try look for our table. So let's look for the table products. So here. So in order to retrieve or write the query that answers the query questions from example number 2, so you can also write your queries from the previous one. So you just write it below them. So okay, or below it rather. So in order to start a new query, just select from. So I always start with the table name. So since our query requires us to display records coming from the products table, so I will be writing the the products table. So as you can see, we have here the products. So I'm going to type now the products. So from products, make sure you are writing the correct table name. So it should be matched. Then second, I will be reviewing what column should we need to display or the query needs to display. So in our example, we need to display the product ID, the product name, and the price. So let's go back to our SqlYog. So let's look or examine the contents of this table. So to locate the columns, always expand, or all you have to do is to click the info. So I am now examining the products table, and so as you can see, I am now seeing the column or the field of the table. So since the query requires the product ID, so I will be writing the product ID followed by comma, product name, because in our query example, it requires product name right here and the item price. So let's go back and type our table name, product name rather, and the price. As you can see, so the price pertains to the column or the field unit price. So unit price. So after you type your query, you can now run. Make sure the cursor is blinking inside the statement. Okay, because if your query is blinking outside the statement, for example, and you click the run, the result will be no query were executed because your cursor is pointed outside the statement. So make sure your cursor is pointed inside the query statement. And by the way, what you are seeing right now are two queries. So you can also execute these two queries at the same time by clicking or by clicking the execute all queries. But for now, let's execute query one at a time. So I'm going to point out or point my cursor here and click the execute query. Okay, so now I have now the result of my query. So as you can see, what my query result have or retrieve are three columns: the product ID, the product name, and the unit price from products table. So that answers our query requirement example number 2. Okay, so notice that my queries is in a multi-line format, so it's just a style consideration only. So it's okay to use multi-line or single line and make sure that line is terminated with semicolon. So let's try another example. So in our next example, so the query question is, what is the name or product ID 19? So which means you are retrieving the name of the product with a product ID equals to 19. So we have now what we call criteria. So if your query question has this requirement, which means you need to write a condition in your query. So let's try. So in your SqlYog, all you have to do is to write your query. Okay, so let me try to write another query. So again, I'm going to write first the keywords from, since the query requires me to retrieve a product, so which means the records came from the products table. There. And it requires me, or the query requires the product name. So let's identify the column that pertains to product name. So here, so let me type the product name. Okay, so let's try. Before I create a condition, let me first try to execute this query. So now, this is now the result of the query. But our query example requires us to display specific products rather than all of the list or records coming from the products table. So it requires product ID 19. So as you can see, we already have the keyword here. So it means we need to figure out the product ID that is equivalent to 19. So let us try to perform our query using our SqlYog. So to do that, notice that our query is retrieving the entire products from products table. So how can we eliminate other product from the result? So to do that, all you have to do is to insert a new keyword, and that is a where clause. A where clause allows us to specify condition to limit the number of rows retrieved from the query. So where clause. So the syntax is where and followed by a condition. So a condition is the statement that you use to provide a statement that match the record coming from the table. So let's try. Okay, since we are trying to define the product ID equivalent to 19, so let me write the column that pertains to product ID. So in our table, it has product ID column or field. Make sure the statement is equivalent to the column name, like this one. And then it says that we need to display equivalent to product 19. So to do that, you need to use equal symbol. So this symbol is used to define equality of the matching record. So we are telling that the query should display only the products whose product ID is equivalent to 13. So let's try to execute this command. Okay, so as you can see, the query retrieves the product that equivalent to product ID 13. So that's how you write the query for example number 3. Okay, so as you notice, I have used the operator. So it's a mathematical operator, or a relational operator rather, that compare one value to another value. So let us examine other operators that we can use for condition. So in where clause, you can use equal sign to check the equality of the two value. You can use this symbol for not equal, or it depends upon the database. So you can use this one, or greater than, the less than, greater than or equal, and not equal relational operator. Okay, so that's the valid operators for our conditions. Okay, so how about another example? So let's continue. Okay, how about this one? Which customers are from Mexico? So you need to show the customer ID, the company name of the customer, the contact name, and the contact title in the result. So notice that we are pertaining to the customer, so which means we need to look for our table customers in our database. In the criteria, the customer location should be from Mexico. So let us examine our database first before we proceed to our query. So in our SqlYog application, you need to browse our table that is customers, and let's expand the columns. So also you can also examine the records. So as you can see, we have here list of customers from the database, and let's try to retrieve first the common rows. So select from customers. Okay, so in our query, the required column that we need to display is, or rather, are the following: the customer ID, company name, and contact name, and a contact title, of course. So to do that, so you need to identify the column for the customer ID. So in this case, the customer ID is this one, customer ID, followed by comma, then the customer or the company name. Again, make sure the column or field that you type in your statement should be matched with the table field. Okay, that's why you need to expand or reference this info or expand the column names coming from the table. Okay, now what else? Okay, so aside from that, you need also to display the contact name. So I have here the contact name, so I just copy paste it. Okay, and of course the contact name, or rather, yeah, the customer, the company, contact name, and the contact title. So let us locate the contact title. Okay, this one, then copy paste. So let's try to run initially our query. Okay, so as you can see, it's a good thing that we have this error. So what does it mean? So notice that my query is wrong because it has an invalid syntax. Instead of using semicolon, I use comma. So let's use semicolon. Notice when you write an invalid query statement, it provides error message like this one. So one query executed, one error. So the query, you have an error in your SQL syntax. So check the manual. So upon checking, we have an error in our syntax. So in this case, we have put comma instead of semicolon. Okay, so let's try to run it again. Okay, so now I have satisfied the first requirements to display the customer ID, the company name, the contact name, and the contact title. So now our query requires us to display the location. So we need to identify how can we display customers that are located in Mexico. So let us examine our database. Okay, if you try to examine the fields contained in the table, notice that it has a column country. So it pertains to country. So let's try. So upon examining the data, so you can also examine the data from the table data tab and look for the column country. So notice we have already identified that the column that pertains to Mexico is country. So let's try to write a query where country equals Mexico. Now, when you write condition, you need to use a literal for string literal. So you need single quote for a string literal. For numeric, it's okay not to use single quotes. So you need to use single quote for string literals or dates. So in this case, since Mexico is a string, you need to enclose it in a single quotation. So let's try executing the query. Okay, so which means these list of customers that I retrieved came from Mexico. So that's how you make a query that conditions string. So notice in the previous query we used numeric, so that's why it has no single quotation required. But in this case we have a string, so you need to enclose them or the string into a single quotations. So this is now the answer for our query example number 4. Okay, that's it. Okay, let's proceed to our next example. So our next example is example number 5 rather. So let's examine the query requirements. So in this example, we need to display employees that were hired on October 17, 1993. So you need to show the employee first and last name. So the first name and last name and the title in the result. So which means the record came from possibly the employees table. So let's examine the contents or the tables of our database. Okay, so in our database we have employees table. So therefore in our query, when we write our select statement, the records came from employees. Okay, so now let's go back to our requirements. So you need to display the first and last name and the title in the result. So therefore, we need to examine what are the columns in that employee table. So I have the last name. So last name, first name, comma, and title. So let's try executing them. Okay, so now I have satisfied the required column names or the columns that we need to display in our result. Now, let us try to put a condition to specify dates. When you write dates, you need to specify the column of the table. In this case, hire date is the exact match that pertains to the query question. So it says that hired October 17, 1993. So to do that, you need to specify the column hire date in our query. So in this case, if you try to examine the columns of the table, as you can see, we have the column hire date. So let's try hire date equals. Okay, when you write dates, it requires us to put single quotations to define date. In MySQL database, in order to query date, you must first type the year, the 4-digit year, followed by months, and followed by day. In this case, if you try to examine the required date, so October 17, 1993, so therefore, we need to put 1993. Since October, if you try to count the number of months of October, it's equivalent to 10, and the date is equal to 17. So that's how you write the query for dates. It must be follow the format year, month, and date. So let's try. Okay, so if you try to examine the result, we only have 3 employees. So if you try to examine the data, so as you can see, let us check the 1993 and 17. So as you can see, we have from the result, is it match the result coming from the database table? 17. Okay. So October 17. So therefore, we have a matching 2 records from the database. Okay, so our query is correct. So in order to verify that your query is correct, you can execute the query and check the table if it is matched based on the query. Since we are using the hire date as our criteria, and we try to provide a criteria for October 17, 1993, so therefore these 2 records match our criteria, so our result is like this one. Okay, so that's how you query dates. It's the same with querying string, but you need to provide date format to ensure that the date is properly conditioned for query. Okay, so next, let's proceed to our next example from our query. Okay, so our example number 6 is which meat or poultry products that is under category equivalent to 6 have less than 10 units in stock. Show the product ID, product name, category ID, and units in stock in the result. So therefore, we are looking for products table, and we need to display the following column: the product ID, the product name, the category ID, and the unit in stock. So let's go back to our SqlYog and try to retrieve the product records of the products table. So to do that, let's create a statement from products. Okay, because our table name is products. Okay, like this one. And The required columns are the following. So the first required column is the product ID. So therefore, we need to type the product ID. Another column requirement is the product name. Product name. And category ID. Category ID. And last, the unit in stock. So notice we have unit in stock here. Okay, so let's try executing this query and see what will be the result. Okay, so notice we have now the list of products that shows specific columns required for the query. So now let us examine the requirements. So in our query example number 6, the requirement is you need to display products that has category equivalent to 16. So notice we have this equivalent to 16 and has or have less than 10 in stock. So to do that, let us satisfy our first condition. So this is now our first condition. So our query must have a condition that shows record that is category equivalent to 6. So to do that, okay, where category ID equals to 6. Okay, let's go back. And unit in stock. So in this particular second condition, you need to construct a second condition that satisfies the requirements. So in this case, in order to add additional condition, we need to use logical operator AND. A logical operator AND is an operator that we need to use to add additional condition. This means that both conditions must be true so that we can display the required records to display, or both conditions must be true or you need to be satisfied in order to retrieve the record. So in this case, the units in stock must be less than, or let's say less than 10. So in this case, we have constructed two conditions. The product should be category 6 and the stock should be less than 10. As you notice, I have used the AND operator that ensure that both conditions must be satisfied in order to display the result. So let's try executing that. Okay, so as you notice, I have displayed record that has category ID number 6 and the stocks is less than 10. In this case, we have records that has less than 10. In this case, the stocks of these three products are zeros. So as you notice, if we try to examine the table, so we have several categories. We have 3 products that equivalent to category 6, and notice that their stocks is less than 10. So that's the result of our query, and that's how you develop queries with what we call multiple conditions. In logical operator, we have OR operator. The OR operators allows us to at least satisfy one condition. So in this particular example, it's either category is 6 or the unit stock is less than 10. So let's try executing this example. So as you notice, the result is now different from previous one. Since we are using an OR operator, it's not required that both conditions must be satisfied. In this case, OR operators allows us to either the category 6, as you notice, we have category 6, or unit in stock is less than 10, which means either of the two must be true so that we can satisfy our conditions or our query conditions. So that's the big difference between OR and AND. The AND operator requires this condition must be true and the other condition must be true to display the result, while OR operator, either of condition must be true. That's why you are seeing lots of result in this particular conditions. Okay. Okay, so let's conclude our example query statements. So please go back in to your LMS material to read the lesson for select statement and try the exercise. Make sure you already review the lesson or the contents of the lesson or the module that I have given to ensure that the exercise will be completed. Thank you and good luck to your activities.